Almost all we currently think we know about Jesus comes from the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Even if they were the authors, Matthew and John were the only evangelists who were members of the 12 disciples, and therefore could have been witnesses to the events. Luke was a physician and a companion of St. Paul, and Mark was an interpreter who probably worked with St. Peter in Rome, and some say he may even have been St. Peter's son. These four Gospels were all apparently written between 40 and 100 years after the crucifixion. The fact is that although we know them by those four names, modern biblical scholars cannot be absolutely sure who really wrote them.
Originally, all these Gospels circulated anonymously. There were no names attached to them until almost 200. And the Christian theologian who came up with the idea of having a New Testament was roundly condemned as a heretic.
So we begin our Mass by thinking of the times when we've been unfaithful to the Lord, and we ask for his forgiveness.
The reason that the priest would tell us what the Bible said is that the original texts are full of inconsistencies.
Jesus said to them, "How many loaves have you?" 7, they said, "and a few small fish."
For example, then, did Jesus feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fishes? Or 4,000 people with 7 loaves and a few small fish? Or did he, as is recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, do both of those things?
They all ate as much as they wanted.
So historically, how reliable can the Gospels be? One story on which they are all clear, concise, and more or less agree is the story of the crucifixion.
This is the Gospel of the Lord.
The crucifixion began at the 3rd hour.
And it was the 3rd hour, and they crucified him.
Some think that the Gospel according to Luke has the shortest crucifixion.
It was about the 6th hour, and when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he gave up the ghost.
Matthew and Mark clearly have Jesus surviving a little longer.
And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out.
The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written in the Roman Empire, far from Jerusalem. Each has a different version of events of Jesus' life and death.
None of the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. They're all written several decades later. Even the earliest is probably about 4 decades later. So you've got to reckon with at least 40 years, if not 50, 60 years, of changing traditions, speculation on the traditions being changed so that they speak more to particular communities. So actually, when you look at them, there's really quite a lot of inconsistencies between them.
If you just put the Gospels in kind of a chronological order, it's actually layered. You can just peel off the layers like a sort of forensic investigation. At the bottom, you've got that core story of Mark. Mark was the earliest Gospel. And there Pilate's innocent, but there's not this huge point made about it. Matthew, who writes next, has ratcheted it up considerably. Pilate washes his hands. His wife has a dream. Jesus is a righteous man, don't bother him. And the Jews take on the guilt. And then you go to Luke, it's the Mark story, but it's amped up. And it's getting louder and louder. And the basic idea is Pilate was just an innocent bystander, a necessary part of the story. And then John, he has them almost having a philosophical discussion. We're moving completely, I think, out of the realm of just straight history.
The Gospels aren't historical fact. There's no hard evidence that any event in them actually happened. There isn't even proof that Jesus existed. But the existence of another person is confirmed. The notorious Roman governor, Pontius Pilate.
while the resurrection may be fundamental to the faith, the gospel accounts of it, unlike those of the crucifixion, are full of inconsistencies and curious contradictions.
When we read the resurrection narratives, it's like reading 4 different reports of the same football game in 4 rather different newspapers. And the fact that actually there may be some disagreement about whether it was a foul or not doesn't mean that there wasn't a game and that somebody didn't win it and so on. If one of them says there were 2 angels and another one says there was 1 angel, if one of them says Mary Magdalene was there all by herself and somebody else says Mary Magdalene was there with 1 or 2 other women, then these are the sorts of variations that you expect to get, like the different newspaper reports of the football match. And they're not something that should worry you to the point of saying, therefore nothing happened. That would be quite a false conclusion.
But the Gospels do not just disagree about the number of angels or how many women arrived at the tomb. When it comes to the resurrection, the Gospels literally lose the plot. In the earliest versions of the earliest Gospel, Mark, there are no resurrection appearances at all. The Gospel simply ends with the discovery of an empty tomb. The last verses of Mark, which do contain resurrection stories, were added 200 years later. Matthew and Luke do have resurrection appearances, but they don't agree about the details. In Matthew, Jesus meets the women near the tomb, and then meets his disciples just one time, and that is on a mountain in Galilee. In Luke, Jesus meets 2 unnamed disciples who do not recognize him, and then meets with the remaining disciples before leaving them in a village just outside Jerusalem. The last Gospel, John, has many different stories that do not appear in any of the other Gospels. Having all these differing Gospel versions of the story is confusing.
The Gospels describe Jesus and the other reclining diners dipping into the same bowl at the Last Supper.
He said to them, "It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the bowl with me."
But what food was in those bowls? 3 Gospels say that Jesus' Last Supper was the lamb feast held on the first night of Passover.
And they prepared the Passover meal.
But one Gospel says it happened the night before.
Now before the festival of the Passover, during supper.
Finding out which version is correct not only affects the menu, it also could change the guest list and the entire meaning of the Last Supper.